Another thing, I want to thank the Montana Committee for the Humanities. They're partially sponsoring this event. They helped us bring Holmes Ralston and Ned Hedinger out, and also John Hart. And so we really appreciate them for helping us fund this event and making it happen. Wouldn't happen without them. The other thing is there is one more event in this, Exploring the Landscapes of Environmental Thought, and that's tomorrow night. Holmes Ralston will be talking about biology and philosophy and religion, so I think that'll be a very interesting event. And we just wanted to thank our distinguished panel for coming, and we thank you for coming as well. Also on your way out, you'll see that there's complimentary copies of the High Country News, and please take those as you see fit. And one other announcement. John Hart is just completing a book called The Sacramental Commons, and there's a flyer out there if you're interested in picking that up. I don't think the book's out yet, but will be out in September. So tonight I get to take the night off, and Christopher Preston, a good friend, he's a fellow at the Ethics, is in the philosophy department here at the University of Montana. He's well equipped to do this talk. He's writing an intellectual biography of Holmes Ralston and is coming out co-edited a collection of essays on Holmes's environmental philosophy. So I think I'll let Christopher introduce the panel, and thank you again for coming.
I wanted to add a word of thanks to everyone for coming too. I know it's not just because this building is air conditioned. The Center for Ethics is delighted at the way this couple of weeks has gone. We've had these evening events and we've had great attendance, and it's very gratifying for us all to work over there. This is a challenging area, challenging but very important. The intersection of science, religion, and environment provides a tough landscape on which to dwell. The first two disciplines on that list, science and religion, initially appear to be located on opposite ends of the spectrum of human understanding. One is a quest for facts, the other a quest for meaning. Each has their own methodologies, their own high priests and priestesses, and their own foot soldiers. To most listeners, they appear to speak in different tongues. But when the third term on that list is added, environment, we're forced to recognize that science and religion really ought not to be so isolated from each other. Questions such as, what kind of being am I? And how must I live my life? Are simultaneously and inseparably both scientific and religious questions. With the human impact on Earth becoming ever more manifest to our eyes, this inseparability may be more true now than ever before. To borrow a phrase from Dr. Hart's new book that was just mentioned, Sacramental Commons, our age seems to increasingly demand from us the integration of social and ecological common good. If you want to restate. Now, the discussion tonight can range pretty widely. What we're going to do is have Holmes Ralston open up with a few remarks based on a paper that's just about to come out in the journal Environmental Values, and then we'll give each of the panel members a chance to use Dr. Ralston's remarks as a springboard for their own comments on the topic. We'll then have the panel fire a few questions at each other before opening it up to the audience here. And I hope that we'll start opening it up to the audience around about 8:20, 8:25, something like that. So we have pretty free range about where we go. Just a couple of sort of possible questions on the topic of this dialogue between science and religion. How do we integrate those vocabularies if they are so different? How do we work at getting a dialogue going? What are some of the common goals that are sought by both those disciplines? On the topic of religion, and particularly Christianity, a lot of you probably know Lynn White's quote that Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever known. I mean, is that true? Was that ever true? Have things changed since then? So are there some new eco-theologies being developed within Christianity to move away from White's complaint? And on the topic of environment, There was an interesting case in the late 1990s where the Forest Service got sued by a logging group for preventing logging from happening in a certain forest. And the basis of the suit is that the Forest Service were promulgating a religious view, environmentalism. Okay, so is environmentalism a religion or a religion of some kind? In the intelligent design debates that surface every so often at the moment, the advocates for intelligent design often counter that teaching Darwin is teaching a religion. It's just a non-theistic religion. So we might want to go in that direction. But as I say, we're pretty free to take this discussion wherever we want to go, and it will be up to you to jump in and lead it that way. So I'm going to just quickly read some biographical remarks about those in our panel. Albert Baldwin, sitting here on this side, is Regents Professor of Philosophy at the University of Montana. He's taught here since 1970. His special area is the philosophy of society and culture. And amongst his publications are Technology and the Character of Contemporary Life, Crossing the Postmodern Divide, Holding On to Reality, The Nature of Information at the Turn of the Millennium, Power Failure, Christianity and the Culture of Technology, and coming out later on this year, Real American Ethics, University of Chicago Press. On the other side, Dr. John Hart is Professor of Christian Ethics at Boston University School of Theology, where he founded that doctoral program in ecological ethics. Previously, he served as a professor of theology and founding director of environmental studies at Carroll College over in Helena. He's authored 4 books, Sacramental Commons, which we've mentioned, What Are They Saying About Environmental Theology, Ethics and Technology, Information and Transformation in Community Contexts, and The Spirit of the Earth, A Theology of the Land. Not only that, but he's been a ghostwriter for several church environmental statements, has worked with indigenous peoples, spiritual leaders, and human rights activists, has been involved with the development and dissemination of the Earth Charter, and given some 200 presentations on 4 continents, including 28 U.S. states. He served as vice president of the board of the Wild Divide chapter of the Montana Wilderness Association, and serves on the board of directors of the Montana Environmental Information Center. He and his wife, Jane, have 2 children pursuing professional careers. Ned Hedinger, some of you might have seen him speak on aesthetics a couple of nights ago. Professor of philosophy at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. He works primarily in issues of environmental philosophy and ethics and has a growing interest in environmental aesthetics. He's published several dozen papers, including articles in journals such as Philosophy of Public Affairs, the Boston College Environmental Affairs Law Review, Environmental Ethics, Environmental Values, and Ethics in the Environment. His paper, Justifying Intellectual Property, was chosen for inclusion in the Philosopher's Annual as among the 10 best philosophy articles published in the year it came out. And sitting right here, Holmes Ralston III is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Colorado State University, where he has taught for over 35 years. Formerly a 3rd-generation Presbyterian pastor in the Valley of Virginia, in 1975, he helped birth the academic field of environmental philosophy with a paper titled, Is There an Ecological Ethic? 6 monographs and more than 150 articles later, he's often called the father of environmental ethics.
That's been changed. It's now the grandfather.
And in 1997, he gave the prestigious Gifford Lectures in Natural Theology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, out of which came a book with the title Genes, Genesis, and God. And in 2003, he was awarded the Templeton Prize for Discoveries in Science and Religion in London, an award he donated to his alma mater, Davidson College in North Carolina, to endow a chair in science and religion. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Holmes.
Thanks, Christopher. Well, let me make a provocative claim right at the start that science can't teach us what we most need to know about nature, which is how to value it. Now, you might think, well, if you want to value nature, you need to go and talk to an ecologist or a soil scientist or somebody like that. And that's a good idea. In a way, environmental concerns are sort of like medical concerns. You want to be healthy. And health is easy to advocate, so you might say, well, to a soil scientist or a climatologist or something, what's going to keep us a healthy environment? And so that's true enough. Go and talk to these people. On the other hand, if you're trying to make deeper decisions about the use of natural resources for good or ill, how much wilderness we need in Montana or in the Rocky Mountain West, if you're trying to make decisions about reallocating resources between the rich and the poor in third world countries, first world countries, you're just not going to get help much from ecologists, for example. In that sense, many of the deeper questions about caring for nature, concern for nature, many of the deeper value questions are as sharp and as painful as they've ever been, even after we get better and better science. Now, if you think I'm picking on ecologists or natural scientists, I could say the same thing about economists. If you were to think that economics is a science, as some do at least at my university, if we are thinking about problems in global capitalism and what it's doing to the natural world, we're thinking about sustainable development versus sustainable biosphere, if we're thinking about, again, how much wilderness to set aside in the state of Montana or in Africa, or what to do with the elephants or the rhinos. We need the economists. They may tell us what's likely to work or not work, or what we can or can't finance, but they don't have any special competence in making these deeper decisions about how to value nature. If you need a little proof of that, just read the newspapers, in the sense that these issues about what to do with the natural world, how to care for it, are as sharp and as painful as they've ever been in the history of the human race. Now you might say, well, religion's been around longer than science and economics, and we don't have these problems solved either. So I probably need to turn to the idea, well, what does religion have to offer? And I might say I don't think religion teaches us how nature works, but religion might teach us something about how human nature works. In that sense, we might now want to get those of a religious outlook into the conversation about what to do about the nature of human nature in relationship to the environment. If I could again put this bluntly and in terms of my own Christian tradition, but drawing as much from the Jewish tradition, the Hebrew people had the idea they lived in a promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. But their prophets repeatedly told them that the land would not flow with milk and honey unless they lived in justice and in righteousness. So they had this basic idea that, yes, it's a good earth, but it's a good earth that can be good for all. It's a good earth in which there can be peace, if and only if justice rolls down like waters. I don't think you're going to find that in any physics textbook or biology textbook or chemistry textbook or economics textbook. In that sense, this idea that the land, to give of its goodness, must be characterized by people who live on that landscape with some sense of justice and righteousness, seems to me still to be as needed as it's ever been. Well, you might say, yeah, that's about people and their resourceful use of the landscape, but that doesn't tell us much about caring for nature. Now, maybe we want to ask about what does religion have to say, not simply about the uses of nature that we humans might make, but what about caring for nature? My mind goes to a Scientific American cover story in which the authors, it's called Managing Planet Earth, right? And these authors say there are two main questions we need to ask. One is what kind of planet do we want, and what kind of planet can we get? I might say, well, maybe a religiously oriented person would start with those questions. What kind of planet do we want, or can we get? But a religiously oriented person might want to say, well, is our only relationship to the planet one of engineering it for the better? Now I want to say yes, but didn't the Hebrew peoples have the idea that they lived in a land that was a gift, God's creation, a good earth, a sacred earth? So maybe at least when we now look at this marvelous planet that we inhabit, we would want to ask some of these questions about the wealth and richness of biodiversity on it. Now the scientists are going to have a lot to tell us about how rich it is, about how this has evolved over millennia. Maybe the economists are going to need to say something about how much it's going to cost to save the wolves or the grizzly bears or the Amazon forest and so forth. But in the end, these questions about whether and how we ought to care for the goodness of this earth, seeing life as a gift on a good earth, seems to me once again we're back in the province of religiously oriented explanations. Management, being an overseer, being a trustee, these are words we can use. These are words we can get some help from economists and scientists on. But it seems to me the deeper solution of these value issues is still basically a religious kind of question. Now, I do think there's a theme throughout many religions, including the biblical religions, that there's something about life on earth that is sacred, that people respect a good earth, a sacred earth, and now in terms of our duties to each other and caring for the lions, the tigers, the wolves, the richness of earth, we want a vision. John Hart's a sacral community, and we may be required to have that kind of vision. If we go back to the commandments, the 10 commandments, the last one is thou shalt not covet. Now, maybe what science has done, coupled with economics, has given us escalating powers to covet. Consumerism. More and more. Now what we want to do is get in place powers to control our covetousness. That might be something that religion can teach us, but science nor economics, and economics cannot.
Ned is up next.
Great, thanks. I'm quite honored to be on such a distinguished panel. I say that first of all. I want to make 3 points. First, I don't think there should be a conflict between religion and science, either in general or with regard to the environment. Properly understood, religion and science needn't compete. Science deals with facts and causes of the natural world. Religion deals with the meaning and value of those facts and causes. You only get a conflict, in my mind, when one of those is taken out of its proper domain and put into the domain of the other. So, for example, some people think science shows the universe to be meaningless. That's really a religious position, not a scientific one. Others think their religion requires them to reject certain scientific facts and believe that, say, God made the earth in 7 days, or God made humans specially and separate from the evolutionary process. So I very much agree with Holmes's point that science can't tell us what kinds of a planet we ought to have. Science can't do ethics' job. But I worry that Holmes's theology does take religion into the domain of science. It does have religion do some of the work of science. Holmes, in his writing, gives God a causal explanatory role. God leads and lures evolution upward. God fine-tunes the universe for life, and many other suggestions of that sort. So I'd like to ask Holmes and all the panelists to what extent they think God is a causal player in the world, and if so, how this can be made compatible with science. The second point I want to make is I don't know whether we need to go beyond secular values, ethics, aesthetics, to religion in order to account for the meaning and value of nature and to explain why we should protect it. Holmes has just suggested that we should. I find him awfully persuasive in lots of ways, and here too to some extent, but I'd like to hear more and why. It could be that secular values are sufficient to ground our valuing of nature and reasons for protecting it. But let me suggest 2 ways that religion might be needed for proper valuing of nature. One, in understanding the incredible value of the natural world. Phrases like, nature is a miracle, it's precious, it's sacred, it's a gift. Wild nature is a kind of holy place. Those are powerful phrases that capture a kind of value of nature that it's hard to capture with just pure ethical or aesthetic language. The other way religious concepts might be useful, and then without them we can't sufficiently, I think we might not be sufficiently able to condemn the human mistreatment of the planet. So we're despoiling the earth, we're taking over the planet, we're driving other life forms extinct, and that may not be just morally wrong or a violation of rights of other species, that kind of moral language, but maybe we need to think of it as a kind of sacrilege or desecration or idolatrous worship of humans. Religious concepts may be useful in understanding the nature of this wrong and also in understanding the value of the earth. So my final point is that if we do need religion, what I call an immanent naturalistic spirituality should suffice. Basically the idea that the holy is in nature, immanent within it. And the idea of a belief, I think, in a transcendent, supernaturalist, otherworldly religion with a personal deity who's importantly responsible for the earth, I think creates a host of problems for valuing nature in a proper way, at least the way I think we should. Let me mention 3. First of all, the fundamental importance of and value and glory moves away from this earth and resides in the transcendent Creator. Secondly, the miraculous nature of the earth with its millions of species and spectacular beauty, I think, is diminished once we see this as the result of a conscious orchestration by a deity. So an important reason why we value nature so much and we find it so amazing is that it's not the result of a planned, intentional process. And if an all-perfect God is behind nature, then one would expect the beauty and value we find in nature. It wouldn't be so incredible. In fact, one might expect more beauty and value. Finally, valuing nature for its wild, spontaneous character no longer makes sense to the extent that nature is the result of mind and purpose. Instead of nature being a spontaneous, unmanaged performance that amazingly exists, nature becomes a divine manifestation, lovingly given. Just as human presence in wild nature diminishes its wild otherness, so does God's presence in and behind nature. There is another person there. So my view is that transcendent religion makes valuing nature properly more difficult.
9 years ago, I happened to be at a meeting at the University of Colorado in the same area. There was a meeting of the Sierra Club. And one of the people in my group who knew about the Sierra Club told them that I had written some church documents and I mentioned I might be interested in doing an article for Sierra Magazine on religion and the environment. I didn't hear from them for 4 months, and then I got a call from a person named Trebby Johnson, and she said she had been commissioned by Sierra to write the article. I guess I was too close to the topic to be, quote, objective. So she interviewed me. She was very hostile. She seemed to think Christianity had nothing whatsoever good to do with the environment, that Christians just focused on the next life and didn't care what happened to this life. They were interested in getting to heaven and not in conserving the earth. By the time the article came out, maybe some of you saw, it was a major article, November, December of 1998 in Sierra, plus a whole series of other articles focused on how different religions were, in fact, in different ways, engaged in practical projects, had issued document statements from their leadership about caring for creation. And the editor of Sierra Magazine mentioned at that time that he had to apologize because he assumed that Christianity had nothing whatsoever, no concern about the environment. He was kind of quoting Lynn White's article, which now is almost 40 years old. It came out in Science Magazine in 1967. And as I travel across the country, some people still quote Lynn White as if nothing has happened for the last 40 years. They really have to update their understanding of what religions have been doing in terms of shifting consciousness and trying to work to care for the environment. Same thing happened a couple of years ago. I spoke at the Montana Wilderness Association annual meeting, and some of the questions were, how many Christians really think this? As if, again, Lynn White rules that the same attitudes that happened 40 years ago. I've seen anthologies of environmental studies programs where the only article they have about religion is Lynn White's 1967 article attacking Christianity for being, quote, the historical root of our ecologic crisis. So things have changed. I want to assure those of you who are not familiar with some of these changes, hope that you will do some more investigating along those lines. Edward O. Wilson, a biologist that might be familiar to some of you, if you read his autobiography, it came out a number of years ago. He has a quote in there, "Am I an atheist reductionist?" Yes, exclamation, yes, exclamation, yes, exclamation. So he was unabashedly identifying himself as that. He now calls himself a secular humanist. He was part of a video called Keeping the Earth, Science and Religious Perspectives on the Environment. I highly recommend it too. It's a half-hour video narrated by James Earl Jones. Has different people talking about caring for the environment, religion, and science coming together on this particular issue. His new book coming out in September is called The Creation, A Meeting of Science and Religion. And he says religion and science are the two most powerful forces in the world today. And that to solve ecological questions, ecological issues, it's necessary for scientists and people from religious traditions to work together. He has a neat phrase there. He says, let us meet on, quote, the near side of metaphysics. That it's time to get beyond arguments, philosophical, metaphysical arguments, and get down to practical efforts to try to rid ourselves of some of the human-caused environmental crises that we face today. On the issue of religion, I thought I'd give a brief quote from the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Issue Statement in 2001 on the Columbia River watershed. I was a ghostwriter for that, one of the ghostwriting stints that I had over time. And they have 10 what they call considerations for community caretaking. And they basically serve as 10 principles of caring for the environment. And I'll just read through these, and if you want to come back to those, you can read the document. It's available online and so on. Number 1 is consider the common good. 2, conserve the watershed as a common good. 3, conserve and protect species of wildlife. 4, respect the dignity and traditions of the region's indigenous peoples. 5, promote justice for the poor, linking economic justice and environmental justice. 6, promote community resolution of economic and ecological issues. 7, promote social and ecological responsibility among reductive and reproductive enterprises. 8, conserve energy and establish environmentally integrated alternative energy sources. 9, respect ethnic and racial cultures, citizens, and communities. And 10, integrate transportation and recreation needs with sustainable ecosystem requirements. A number of years ago, I taught at Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin, and I put on a piece of paper I distributed to my students some statements from Pope John Paul II on ecological responsibility. I didn't tell them where it came from. And they discussed these statements in groups and said these are very idealistic, and they were good, but they thought, that whoever wrote them was very idealistic about the possibility of caring for the environment. When I told them it was the Pope, they couldn't believe this because they were very familiar with Lynn White's article on historical roots of our ecologic crisis, once again. I thought I'd throw in a couple of thoughts from a friend of mine, an elder by the name of Philip Deere, Muskogee elder. I have a chapter about him in my forthcoming book. And He was a spokesperson for indigenous traditions. He was a spiritual godfather for the American Indian movement. Some of you might be familiar with that, but also for the International Indian Treaty Council, which was a non-governmental organization accredited to the United Nations that worked on human rights issues. And I've worked with that group about 25 years. He said, "We cannot say that I am just a pilgrim passing through. We are the caretakers of this land, and we are part of this creation. So we must respect Mother Earth. We believe in natural laws of love, peace, and respect. We learned this thousands of years ago, and this was the life of our people. When we destroy anything within the creation, we destroy ourselves. We have felt ourselves to be a part of the creation, not superiors, not the rulers of creation, but only part of creation. If we understand these natural ways, natural laws of love, peace, and respect, we will be able to get along with everyone. When we learned about Christianity, we heard about the Father. We learned to pray to the Father, and in the churches every Sunday we heard about Father. To this day, we still hear about Father, but we never hear anything about Mother. But every Indian knows what you mean when you say Mother Earth. Traditional people know what you're talking about. We must all learn to say Mother as well as we say Father. In this way, we will have balance." I think we can link environmental well-being with economic justice. This is sometimes one of the things that's lacking in environmental organizations, where they don't recognize the impacts of some of the environmental policies and the conservation of the environment on working people in different areas. We have to be concerned, I think, about what I call the commons good, that is the good of the commons, the earth that we share as our home and habitat, and also about the common good, that is the good of all of us, not only human beings, but to quote again from indigenous peoples, not only the human people, but also the four-legged people, the finned people, the rooted people, and the winged people, that we should be concerned about all creatures, not just about human beings. So the common good would mean the good of the whole biotic community, the good of all of the community of life. We look for the commons good, that is the good of the place in which we live, the common good, the good of all of us, of all life. But also then we would look for commons goods. Are there things, goods of the earth that should be common to all of us, that are being appropriated by a handful of people? Holmes mentioned the growing gap between the rich and the poor. This is true, of course, not only in our own country, but also globally. What are common goods that we should all be enabled to share? And so we're concerned about common goods that should be shared, and how we should work on acquiring those and distributing them as well. And last thought, a few years ago there was a group in Montana developing called PLACES, Partnership of Labor, Agriculture, Communities of Faith, and Environmental Organizations. So PLACE, just PLACE. I would add an S to that and talk about science as well. That we need coalitions to do as Wilson said, to meet on the near side of metaphysics and to work together despite whatever ideological or philosophical differences we have to care for the earth.
I'd like to add to these thoughtful remarks a reminder of a center that needs to hold if the things that have been said are to turn on it as they should. And I will sort of move sideways toward the center by making 2 points. The first is this. George W. Bush and I are professed and practicing Christians. And yet, when I look at the world, I feel much closer to Ned Hedinger, who is a secularist, than to E.O. Wilson. How come? Ned and E.O. Wilson hold 2 things sacred that many of us Christians do not hold sacred. And that's the natural environment and the welfare of the last and least person on the planet. The way that we hold these things sacred is to respect and to revere them. And when it comes to the natural environment, the people here who have been talking to you practice that reverence by hiking and camping in the wilderness or in the woods. And that's a fine thing. But we don't live in the wilderness or in the woods. So how do we engage and act out the reverence that we feel towards nature and towards the least and last people on this planet. That brings me to my second point. I think the center in everyday life where that reverence that holds nature and people sacred comes into focus is food. Food is what we should hold sacred. And what is it to hold food sacred? It's to eat it judiciously, not waste it, prepare it carefully, and working our way outward, it is to see to it that it's been produced in a way that respects the dignity of the earth, of the people who planted and harvested, and of the animals who constitute some of the food. And this then extends to the social sphere and to the social justice that has been mentioned by several. And it is science that has told us that respect for nature and respect for people will become intricately linked. There is no doubt in our mind that the rich of the rich nations will survive global warming comfortably. When the poor have to flee, the rich people just move and they adapt. And hundreds of millions of people will die due to global warming. Billions can die, and there's still a fine breeding stock for humanity to survive. So the human race is not in jeopardy, but social justice is. And so what we're called upon then is to find a center where we gather the strength beyond being dutiful, which is hard, and to find a moment that is joyful. And although we have to keep all those things in mind, where the food comes from, how it's been produced, how it's been prepared, at the center of all of it is a celebration, a moment of grace and joy. And if you have a regular practice of doing so, you can hope to gain the strength that will make it more likely that when you get up from the dinner table, you'll have the strength to do what you have to do. And let me end on a Christian note for my fellow Christians here. Do with your beloved what Christ did with his beloved. Gather them around the table, say grace, break bread, and that's the moment of grace that will serve you well and give you the strength that you need to carry on in a very difficult world.
Thank you. Shall we let Dr. Hittinger re-pose his question, the one in your remarks there?
Sure. I was asking to what extent panel members think that God is a causal player in the world, and how this can be made compatible with science.
That's tomorrow night. I mean, I don't want to cut that question off too much. It is an important question, but that's a question that's looking backward, looking at ancient natural history and wondering whether God's a causal player in the days of the dinosaurs or in the days of when primates became human. When we're talking about religion and environment today, we're looking at present and future. And we can meet on the near side of metaphysics. We can set aside settling that issue and turn our attention more directly to what the possibilities for the future are in terms of caring for the planet. And now you may find that those who disagree about how we got here can join together in caring for Earth as we face the future.
And that the freedom that's given to the universe is when we have these other kinds of changes, unexpected mutations, or so forth, for example, biology, that take place. So I think it's both the spontaneity and the laws laws that cause things to come into being. And there are other issues of what sorts of divine interventions might there be at particular moments, or what sorts of inspirations to different peoples that would alter the course sometimes of history, or perhaps even of the kinds of developments scientifically that might occur. And that would depend on, I think, a person's perspective as to whether those are just insights that are received or not. I would ask also a kind of a very practical question of my own. As we look at the world, and we can just look at our own country as an example, with global warming, and the impacts are going to be devastating. If you're familiar with the possibilities of Greenland, parts of Greenland melting, the Antarctic, if all this happens, the world's oceans will rise by as much as 50 feet, that's 50 feet, perhaps in as early as the next century or soon thereafter. The tremendous impact this will have on most of the world's population. Do you think that, I address this to the panel and to maybe the audience in general, what is a greater hope of bringing about change if the respective religions would begin to really take on global warming and other environmental issues as part of what they're teaching? Might that be a better hope for change, both in legislatures and other governing bodies, as well as among the citizenry as a whole, than perhaps debating about some of these issues or philosophical speculation about them, or other solely scientific gathering of data? There's sufficient data for a lot of this to be known. But what values do we bring, what commitments do we have, and what organizations might best bring about change? And that was one of Wilson's suggestions, as I mentioned earlier. People have to get together to start to overcome some of these difficulties.
Well, I said I'd open up about now, so we'll do that. Let me just ask, if you ask a question, to keep it relatively concise and end it with a question mark, so the panel knows what they're answering.
I got a question for a boardroom. Bread, yes, we pray for our daily bread. It's a symbol of gathered community, but what are you going to do with not by bread alone sorts of things? And even in your own remarks, you indicated it's much more than bread. Big problem in the United States is obesity. We've got too much bread. It's a matter of not just getting bread, but of distributing the bread, as I think you would want to say. But bread is a symbol, certainly in the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, the bread and blood, wine, is a symbol of much deeper realities, visible signs of invisible realities. And surely by bread you mean bread as an icon for much deeper spiritual realities, do you not?
I don't think that when we experience reality at the deepest, when it moves us most, we make a distinction between the tangible and the intangible. And it's a metaphysical consequence of Christianity adopting Plato that we make that distinction. So what's specifically Christian about the breaking of the bread? It's a promise that's implied in it. And the promise is that in our faint-heartedness and...
But the promise is not that you're going to get plenty of bread.
I'm not and the promise is that in our hour of despair, when we may think that this is going to go nowhere, and we may, flag in our commitment to sharing and to making the world better. There is the example of Christ that inspires us and allows us to carry on, and we have to promise that there will be a point when everything will be saved and redeemed.
Yes, sir.
I agree with John Hart when he said that that science and religion are two of the most powerful forces in the world today. And it does seem, at least historically, when the two tend to merge, there's conflict which arises. Yet, since they are the two most powerful forces, it seems like they're necessary to join in some way to solve some of these environmental issues. I'm asking the panel what you think the best means of minimizing this potential conflict is, so that we can have some practical, tangible solutions.
I think that in the present moment, the best bridge between science and theology is ecology, but not just in the studying the science thereof, but also working together on these very practical issues that impact everybody. And as people come to be more aware of them, they can set aside some of their differences. The problem comes when we have people really want to emphasize the differences, like creationists, for example, or intelligent design proponents and so forth. That would exacerbate the difference, and people aren't as much engaged in some of the issues. There was an expression, I think it goes back fairly early in the church, but I can't pinpoint, I know it was very much used in the Middle Ages, that there are two books by which people learn about God. One was the book of the Bible, and the other is the book of nature. So they obviously saw two ways of learning about God. Over time, some people have separated these out and tried to put them in contradiction because of some of the findings of science and the way they've been carried by particular proponents of scientific ideas. I think it's time to get back to people looking at the issues and try to work together to resolve them instead of focusing so much on the differences. And I think it is possible. It is happening now.
Best bridges are biodiversity and sustainability.
What does sustainability mean?
That's why we need the two talking to figure it out. There are two main tensions. One is sustainable development, which sees Earth as a resource to be exploited, but to be sustainably exploited. The other tension is sustainable biosphere, which sees Earth as a ecological community with humans included to be sustained, and economic activity to be worked out within the realm of a sustainable biosphere. And there, I think, solving that may require the ecologist and the economist and the theologians and secular humanists as well.
Yes, sir.
Einstein said never stop questioning, so I'll ask him any questions. The first thing I want to point out is Lynn White's paper also did not just include Christians, it also included Judaism, right?
It focused on Christianity's use of biblical passages from the Hebrew Scriptures.
Right.
He probably would have been called anti-Semitic if he had attacked Judaism the way he attacked Christianity as being the root of our ecological.
But he did include Judaism.
He included the scriptures that are shared by both.
The Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament are similar. I got a zillion questions.
Lynn White.
I'm a secular humanist, pseudoscientist, recovering Christian. I have, and I was educated during the Lynn White period, the Ralph Nader period, all those periods, and it seems this is deja vu all over. Because my experience as a scientist is that the scientists have been telling our leaders, whether religious, political, whatever, about this stuff, and they seem to be in denial or delusional. And what really counts is the greed and avarice, which are animal characteristics. So, my hypothesis as a scientist is that human beings, are in denial of the fact that we really are animals. And no matter what you put on top of us, Christianity, whatever, we're still the basis for everything we do. Food, shelter, copulation, the survival of the species, whatever, are animal instincts. And looking at our illustrious Christian in the Oval Office, everything he does is animalistic, not Christian. Revenge is not a Christian ideal. Killing people is not a Christian ideal. These are all animal characteristics. And I believe, or maybe my question is, if we stop denying the fact that we are animals, and we develop a secular, humanistic, secular values that can be enforced, and we stop the delusion that we are above everything else on this planet and live for the planet, which has to be sustainable or we're all gone. Overpopulation is our #1 environmental problem.
Let's bring us to a question.
Okay.
What are we to do?
Do you feel that
What are we to do with the fact that at the end of the day we're animals?
Praise the Lord. Let's not beat up on the animals. Animals,
we are animals?
well, we are animals, but we are very special kinds of animals, let's put it
But
that way.
that's our denial and our delusion.
All you got to do is look at the environmental crisis to see that we are special kind of animals. That's no delusion. But now let's recognize that animals have their integrity in their kinds of places. So wolves look around and do their best to find something to eat and kill others to eat it, and may kill other wolves to defend their kill. I think that's entirely appropriate for wolves, but it doesn't follow that human beings should act like wolves. Human beings can act like wolves. Part of the problem is that these elements, whether you want to say they come from an evolutionary heritage, as I do believe, these elements continue in human life. We have some of these animal sorts of instincts that, if you like, is our problem. But our opportunity is that we can be ethical beings as the wolves cannot. We can have rich cultural heritage. We can be religious as the wolves cannot. And so it's our failure to rise above, if you like, our animal heritage that is our problem. Don't fault the animals, fault humans when they do not rise into the opportunities of being fully human. And to do that, as you say, too, we may need the preachings of the Sermon on the Mount, or the prophets, or the Buddha worrying about how to get desire stopped.
But we've had 5,000 years of religion. That's a huge data set, and it's failed us. Where are we now?
This maybe is that every generation has to learn again how to be courageous, how to be brave, how to be loving. Every generation has got to learn again how not to covet. Maybe the problem now is that we have more powers of escalating our consumption than we've ever had in the history of the race. There's Kmarts and Walmarts on every corner of the landscape, right? But we don't have any way of controlling our appetites. We don't know when to say enough. Maybe that's something that Buddha can teach us, or that Isaiah can teach us.
There's a question at the back here.
I have a comment as I try to think through what this man is struggling with. In the book Out of Chaos, there were two words that caught my attention. And he referred to God as disembodied mind. I look back at myself thinking of God, trying to picture him in a human form. But we know he showed up in a bush, or that he comes to us in many different ways while we think physically. Disembodied mind seemed to be, for me, a comforting point of view, perhaps, in our discussion as to what is active in our world, what are our responsibilities in the world. perhaps someone on the panel would talk to this thing that's intangible, and yet we all seem to struggle with.
Somebody want to talk about intangibility or stuff adding, or you want to stay with the tangible?
I mean, we're obviously capable of abstracting thoughts from reality. So there are virtues, there are norms such as social justice, and then, of course, there are the intangibles of mathematics and scientific theories. But as regards the intangibles, the so-called intangibles of the moral life, the good life, we should think of them as anticipations and recollections of great events. And of course, recollections and anticipations are important. You teach kids virtues so that they will be capable of recognizing and acting in those moments of trial in the right way. But if it's just recollections and anticipations, never invigorated and embodied by great people and the things that they actually do, then these values just sort of dry up and float away.
Dr. Hart, quickly, and then
I think that's one of the difficulties of having a sense of both the transcendence and the immanence of divine being, that sometimes people have focused too much on the transcendent God, and it becomes eventually an uncaring or separated God who is not very concerned about what's happening. One of the ideas that I work around is seeing a sense of the divine being as both transcendent and immanent, that is permeating the universe in which we live. And why some people experience this and others do not, I have no clue. We have different stories. You can think of religious leaders having experiences usually outside of human constructed places of worship. You can think of Jesus in the wilderness, Moses was mentioned, Muhammad in a cave, Buddha beneath a tree. A variety of Native Americans, of course, sometimes would go out on specific vision quests, and sometimes they would have visions. One of my friends, David Sohappy from the Columbia River, who was a fisher and fought for fishing rights, others spoke of him as not seeking the Creator out, the Creator sought him, and some of the experiences that he had, the visions that he had. And so these are some experiences that people have. The difficulty that comes in is you have people like televangelists who take advantage of people's belief in the transcendent and give religion a bad name. And again, because of the rarity of some of these kinds of experiences. The other difficulty is if people, and Ned has mentioned this, if people focus too much on a transcendent divine being, then they might just see the reason, as Ned mentioned in his comments, of appreciating nature because it's a creation. Sometimes biblically the idea was that Isaiah, for example, in the book of Sirach complained that people stopped at the beauty of creation and didn't see the Creator behind it. And that sometimes froze people in just looking for signs of divine being in creation, rather than seeing both. And this is something that I see, is that you can both have transcending moments and see the presence of divine being in creation, but there's also a great appreciation. These are not contradictory kinds of experiences. One person can have both kinds. You don't have to think, whenever you appreciate something in nature, that, oh, it's because God created it, that you can become engaged, you can feel a sense of kinship with all life and with Earth itself. It doesn't have to be something that just leads you beyond it. Both of these kinds of things can happen. They are not contradictory kinds of experiences.
Ask the question here.
Many of us are not in a position to make big decisions about the treatment of the environment. Dr. Morgan mentioned food and family dinner as a way to cultivate first the personal and then hopefully more communal, larger respect for people and of nature. If you're not to, or cannot rather, engineer a solution for environmental problems, what are we to do, people in this room, as moral agents to help the environmental problems we face?
The path to real reform is electoral politics. And you just have to press and work for the right candidates. That's all there is to it. And that's sort of the immediate practical task. And here in Montana, where there's just less than 1 million people, you can do amazing things. You can get to know the candidates personally. You can help them. Then there's the philosophical task, right, to think things through. And the big thing is, why are people so ignorant and different about the miseries of the environment and of the poor and the powerless? Why is that? And that's just a fact, if you like it or not. And so you have to break through this. How do you get people engaged again? And that's sort of the long-term thing. But you can't have a moratorium on political engagement till that problem is solved. But I think philosophically minded people, essayists, historians, journalists, and of course philosophy students, they should put their mind to that. And where are people at? Why are they that way? They're decent people. How come they're so terribly indifferent when they could act so powerfully without really suffering any great harm to themselves?
Dr. Hedinger was going to say something.
Well, I want to see if we can get back to the issue of why we need religion rather than ethics. I want to get back to the question of why we need to go beyond ethics to religion, and just to try to formulate it more vividly. Imagine a world where everybody becomes wholly morally good, everybody on the planet, and they deal with environmental problems and social justice problems, and what would that world look like? And then contrast that world with a world where everybody, this first world, everybody's an atheist. Okay? And another world is where everybody all of a sudden becomes religious and deeply and profoundly and properly, whatever that is, religious. And then they seek to solve environmental and social justice problems. And would the worlds be any different that they create, or would the process of changing the world be any different?
What you're saying is religion is a fifth wheel in that kind of circumstance. My question would be is, where in your secular humanism are you going to get the resources to cure covetousness?
Charity is a charity and love for the poor, and I mean none of that has to be religious, right? I mean, the virtues, the generosity and courage and
forgiveness, repentance. You got to cure human brokenness.
So there's the sin. We're sinners, and that's important. That's important for you.
Yeah, it is important for me because it's what stares me in the face every time I read the paper.
But that's different than we just do morally bad things. It's different. It's more than that. It's sinners.
It's got to be fixed. We need redemption.
And will that? Okay, and a people redeemed would make the environmental and social horrors, they would clean that up better than a people who are just courageous and loving, and they miss something because they don't have the religious dimension.
A couple of thoughts. One is I couldn't help but think of John Lennon's song Imagine, of course. Imagine no religion and so forth. The other is the reality of the present moment. One can project and say, okay, what if you have atheists who are good people? Is that better than having people of faith traditions who are or are not good people? But what's the reality today in which we live? We do have people from a variety of faith traditions. What I've observed, and you can think on your own experience too, is that sometimes, and it gets also to the homeless question, why aren't people doing anything? Why are people indifferent, or why they're not knowing what's going on, or why they're not getting involved electorally in the political process? Sometimes there are people who are oriented toward, in the present moment, that the Lutheran Church says something about the environment, or the Catholic Church, or their Buddhist tradition says something. And because they are part of a religion today, we're not going to imagine 100 years from now whatever might eventually occur. But some Buddhists will act in a particular way to conserve the environment because that's part of their religious tradition. Some Catholics will, some Lutherans, some Methodists. You can think of some Jews, some Muslims, Hindus. It's because it's part of a religious teaching. Oftentimes, people are not familiar with the ecological teachings or doctrines or moral principles having to do with ecology from within their own faith tradition. In the present moment, it seems to me it's very important for people to find out, and those of you who are aware of them, to let other people know of the kinds of traditions that are there, or the parts of their tradition that talk about caring for Earth, caring for other creatures, respecting all creatures. God loves all creatures, not just human beings. The world is not just made for humans. That would be idolatry in my perspective. God appreciates all of the world. The world is very good. The first Endangered Species Act, as Calvin DeWitt has pointed out, was when God tells Noah to take all the animals on board the ark. And most of us would see the ark story, the flood story, as a symbolic story, not a literal story. And at the end of the flood story, God makes a covenant with all creatures. It says, the Bible says, with the earth, all the wild and domestic animals as well as people. It's not God's favoritism just toward people. That humans have to learn from this. And sometimes a particular religious tradition, if people are very closely tied to that tradition and they find the teachings of it, they will work on bringing about change. Just look at the last 30 years of changes in a number of faith traditions where they begin to emphasize this. On the other hand, if you're a secular humanist, you might appreciate something like the Earth Charter, which is not geared toward a particular religion. Or even if you belong to a religion, you might see something like the Earth Charter as something that can speak to all peoples, because it doesn't say we should do this because Mohammed said it, or because Moses said it, or because Jesus said it. And I think there's a complementarity between these different kinds of traditions. So today, this very moment, we do have people who are very much part of different religious traditions. And if we want to solve the ecological crisis, then we have to look to how these people can be inspired and their leaders can focus more on these particular kinds of issues. What's going to happen 100 years or 1,000 years from now? Yes, people might be able to do all these things without religion. But in today's world, and we can see the devastation that religion can cause in different parts of the world. But when it comes to these issues, some people will more likely become involved because they are affiliated with a particular faith tradition. If these traditions would focus on these crises, I think we'd have a lot of change that would take place.
Yeah, the lady with the green hat.
I want to go back to one of the original questions that you put up on the screen at the beginning. The question, does Christianity advocate dominion or good stewardship towards nature? And I think Dr. Borgman, you started out by saying that you and George Bush both profess to be Christians, but you don't feel very close to him in the way that he respects or reveres nature. So would you say that he's a Christian advocating more of a dominion orientation towards nature, whereas you're advocating more of a stewardship orientation towards nature? And then if you could just talk a little bit about that and how those two different positions towards nature amongst Christians has affected people's views towards Christianity and towards nature.
Well, the problem with George Bush is, that he got elected by us. And so he reflects what all too many of us are after, and it's not Christian charity, it's not forgiveness, it's the pursuit of prosperity and the hope that prosperity will make us happy. And I think that's always the promise of the Republican Party. They will provide more prosperity than the Democrats. And of course, the whole thing got complicated through 9/11. And in a sense, the prosperity is compatible with what Holmes said, namely a kind of management of the planet so that prosperity is compatible with sustainability. And of course, we're failing on both accounts. So, and for George Bush, I think, and for many of us Christians, Christianity is just sort of a thin overlay on what we really think is important, and that is to become affluent, and affluence will make us happy. There is what I would call a moral malnourishment in this country. People don't have a moral vision that they can share, And the conservatives are better at offering it than the Democrats. The Democrats say, values, leave me alone. Well, now they're trying to catch up. And so they reach for values that are cheap, right? That doesn't require them to change their lives. You know, so if I'm against gay marriage, it doesn't affect me, it doesn't affect my children. I'm in support of it, let it be known. If I'm against abortion, my daughters are past, you know, well, they can deal with that. So that's cheap. And the things that would require us to change our lives, you know, if you have 2 coats, give 1 to a poor person. That part of Christianity is just not being practiced in this country. So it's often called the most Christian country among the dense industrial countries. But I think the Danish are much more Christian than the Scandinavian countries. They give 10 times the foreign aid per as a share of their gross domestic product than we do. So it's shameful for us Christians what's happening in this country. And just to respond to Ned, that's a real challenge. You know, why is it that Ned finds nothing, you know, admirable and nothing that, you know, he finds missing in his life? What sort of lives are we living to a person like Ned that he can, you know, who needs it? That's terrible. And that must make us think.
This is not exactly religion, and it's more environmental, but it's from an article that appeared several weeks ago by Stephen Hawking. And I've kind of written it down a little bit here. It's a suggestion that we should plan on moving to another planet. And he was being very serious, and he said as soon as possible, because he feels that we have already pretty well done in this world. And I believe population is one of the things that he mentioned was something that was dooming and damning all of us, and it had been 50 years ago, or whatever. But those aren't all his quotes, but that's kind of the gist of the article. What do you have not thinking about a Christian world and not really thinking about if everyone were soundly environmentally minded? Would we have enough time, do you think, to correct the things of the world, not on a Christian level, but on a purely workable, scientific, saving type of level in the 20 years that we have?
The problem with moving to another planet is that we would take ourselves with us.
That's what my husband said the same thing. That's the universe.
That's what occurred to me when Hawking says we'll have, I think it was a colony on the moon or a station on the moon. I think he said 10 years in Mars and 20 years. And the problems were overpopulation, the danger of nuclear war, biological war, and global warming. And it seemed to me extremely naive to think that if the same people who have developed all these things go elsewhere, it's going to be different. And that's why we have to, I think, focus on changing perspectives here, not just saying, well, if we go to another world, everything's going to be fine there, because somehow it's going to be different when it's humans are going out there to do these things.
Yeah.
I, too, am thinking back to one of the questions that you had put, Chris, up on the screen earlier, and it has to do with, and I don't remember just how you posed it, a question of language, of religion and the language of science, and do they connect? But you know, I'm actually not sure that that's the most important problem. As I listen to you religiously oriented ethicists, seemingly aware of a lot of science and what science has taught, and scientists I know who've been aware of a lot of questions of values and ethics. What strikes me more as a language problem, as I've been coming to numbers of these talks, is the language of you ethical philosophers and the language of morality in most of America. 2 different planets, talking about living in different planets. The language of the 2 of those, I think, is more problematic. When I hear what's spoken of as morality in most of America, it has nothing to do with what any of you folks are talking about. And perhaps vice versa. There's a language problem. How do we transcend that?
The 7 deadly sins aren't still out there in the churches? Greed, and so forth?
I think you're right. The philosophers have to develop a language that when they talk to people, they're bearers of good news that people can understand. And I think, professional philosophy is very esoteric and ingrown, and much of the traditional language that has still some resonance, like the virtues, wisdom, courage, friendship, moderation, has no purchase, because these virtues were articulated and argued for under cultural circumstances that are so different from ours. So what is it today to be wise? Where is courage needed? What's the problem of moderation? And so I think I can only underscore your complaint. I think philosophers have been missing in action here.
Anyone else on the panel want to?
Well, I think I'm not sure I understand what you're saying, but what I think I understand, I disagree. I think there's been a huge movement in philosophy towards applied ethics and practical ethics, the environmental ethics, environmental philosophy field that I've spent my life in, Holmes and others too, very much trying to address problems and speak to ordinary people. When I teach classes in these areas, students get all excited and riled up, and I think what is happening here at the University of Montana with the Center for Ethics and people giving radio talks and 100 people coming out on a Thursday night. I think philosophers and intellectuals do talk in a way that people care about. They have to be careful, and that they're not just talking to each other and doing a bunch of fine point stuff, but I think they can do both.
What was the lady in the back there?
Earlier there's been a lot of good discussions, but the idea of the 10 Commandments, the 10th Commandment, thou shalt not want, and the effect of consumerism on our society, total disregard in the religious centers, as far as I can see, for 10 Commandments. But one of the primary bridges that I believe, I'm not sure all the people's names here, but I think it was Dr. Hart suggested, was between sustainability and biodiversity. And then there's some discussion about sustainability. But are you aware that sustainability has now been codified as far as a definition in law? It's through the National Forest Management Act, and it actually has 3 elements: the ecologic, economic, and social. It's always kind of confused me how come that the economic and social get 2. But something that this is an honest question, I don't really understand the root of the word ecologic and the root of the word economic. They both seem like they come from the same root. Can anyone on the panel explain to me what that root between those two
means
words
house in
are?
Greek. Egos means house in Greek, I believe.
Yeah, the common root is oikos, which is the Greek word for home. So, ecology is the logic of one's home, but it's a science. Economics is the nomos, or law of one's home. So they have virtually parallel roots, but of course they have different meaning. The word physics basically means nature, but physics has come to mean something more specialized in study of nature. So the etymologies are only partially revealing of what the present subject matters are.
We have time just for one more question. Was somebody at the edge of this question? Or just yes, this lady.
Okay, I didn't want to ask the last question. It's actually 2 questions. Easy question.
In a lot of the Christian religions, I think the teaching avoids anything to do with the environment deliberately. Are there some good resources out there, movies, books, etc., that would be useful to expose people who are teaching within Christian areas to the environmental thinking and not be afraid to teach of it, teach it as a Christian value? Some resources that could be shared with those folks.
The panel are probably going to be too shy to say it, but Power Failure by Albert Borgman, Gene, Genesis, and God by Dr. Ralston, Sacramental Comments by Dr. Hart. Each of those are good places to start. But
You might try the Book of Psalms, the Book of Job, and he reads the first chapters of Genesis.
I think depending on the tradition to which people belong, I think at this point all the what I call the mainstream or mainline churches in the U.S. have some kind of statement about caring for the environment. And you might or might not know, I think it was about, maybe it's 2 months ago now, where conservative evangelicals issued a statement on global warming. And they talked about parting ways with President Bush, whom they usually support on his issues, but they disagree with him on that particular one. So it's now from within the conservative evangelical branch of Christianity. So there's a change of consciousness. I was reminded of Lynn White's, one of his points was that Christianity has to have a change of consciousness. And he also suggested that St. Francis should be the patron saint of ecology. And I was thinking about how Holmes said, I think it was Holmes, or maybe said, some things are pretty easy, or Albert said, some things are pretty easy. In a similar way, the Pope John Paul II declared St. Francis the patron saint of ecology. Now, the world didn't change because of that, but you could claim one objective was met, but that change of consciousness is also taking place, and often people have missed that. When people quote Lynn White as blaming Christianity, they forget he said Christianity should bring about a change of consciousness, and then things could change as well. And so I think if people look at that, if you come from a particular tradition, you can find resources within that tradition, maybe on the web, going to sites or asking pastors in a particular tradition. And the same thing, there's a coalition on Jewish life and environment. There's a variety of, there's a National Religious Partnership for the Environment located in Washington, D.C., which is a coalition of different religious groups. And they're the ones that work together with the Union of Concerned Scientists to put out the video I mentioned earlier, Keeping the Earth. So you have the scientific community and the religious groups as a coalition working together on those issues.
Well, we started 5 minutes late, and we've gone 5 minutes over, so I think that's fair. We'll get the last word to Holmes.
Yeah, because I want to speak to the state of Montana. Why can't Montana be a model state for a sense of living on a sacred landscape, for a strong sense of community, sense of place? Not every state's got the opportunity to mix the goodness of creation with a sustainable landscape that's still an open future for the state of Montana. So go for it. Set the pace for the nation and the world.
Well, thank you.